Welcome to the Friends with Money podcast, brought to you by Money Magazine, creating financial freedom for Australians since 1999.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Friends with Money, Money Magazine's podcast to help you earn, save, and achieve your financial goals. My name is Tom Watson, a senior journalist here at Money Magazine, and as always, it's great to be with you. Did you know that a handful of banks are now giving their users access to a personalised picture of their carbon footprints based on their spending? I did not until very recently, that is, but I had a peek at a colleague's banking app the other day and I found out that during November, her spending on groceries alone contributed 532 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions into the world. I was staggered. Now, that's a rough number, but it is an interesting one, and it really helps emphasize the link between our financial lives and our carbon footprint. It did leave me with a ton of questions, though, and wanting to know a little bit more. So, to give us a bit of a carbon footprint crash course, including some practical tips to help reduce our footprints, I'm pleased to say that we are joined today by managing editor of FS Sustainability, host of the Green Away podcast, and my favorite Melburnian colleague, Rachel Alembakis. Rachel, thank you for joining us on Friends of Money.
I'm blushing, my dear colleague. It's a pleasure to be here. And what a figure, 592.
I know. It was incredible. And also apologies to any other Melburnian colleagues who are listening. I don't think you are, but you never know. Rachel, to start us off, I think we need to go backwards a little bit by addressing the most basic of basic questions. What is a carbon footprint and why does it matter?
Tom, I was so glad when you asked me to come on the show and you gave me this topic because it actually forced me to go back and figure out the definition of a term I have been using for more than a decade.
Good.
All right, so a carbon footprint is a measure of the amount of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere as a result of activities of an individual, an organization, a community, or an investment portfolio. Now, for individuals, that tends to mean a per capita measure, the amount of carbon emitted by our country divided by its population. Or in the example you just gave, I assume the bank did some sort of interpretation, attributed a certain amount of carbon to that particular food spend and divided it and got the number of 592 tons of carbon dioxide.
A lot of carbon dioxide.
Well, it seems, but that's it. This is where we start to get into some of the limitations. There's strengths and weaknesses of the carbon footprint. On its own, 592 tons of carbon dioxide sounds kind of shocking. But what does it actually mean in context? And I think this is one of the carbon footprint has become sort of a shorthand. It's an easy statistic that we can look at and say, okay, this activity is more carbon intensive than another activity, or this investment portfolio is more intensive than another carbon footprint. But there's strengths and there's weaknesses to the measure.
Well, let's get into perhaps some of the strengths to start off with, and then we can get into some of the weaknesses. Why is it a good or useful metric?
I think the example you gave just now is really where the strength is. You can get a number, right? And you can go, oh my gosh, maybe this is something I can reduce. Maybe this is something I can focus on in my choices in my personal life. So it gives you something to work with. What gets measured, get managed. This is what we live by here at Rainmaker Information.
How about some of the limitations then?
Now, as a late-stage Gen X who was raised and steeped in diet culture, I will give you an analogy. Carbon footprint is a lot like BMI.
Okay, I do know what BMI is. This is good. Yep.
It's a blunt measure, right? So what does that 592 mean? Is it related to this person's specific choices, i.e. they went for the kilo of bagged carrots as opposed to picking loose carrots and putting it into their nice, brought from home, handmade shopping bag that they then took on their bike and rode home consuming zero carbon. It's an approximation that can be attributed down to an individual, and that can be an estimate sometimes. So is it an accurate picture? Not always. And then if you're looking at it from a financial perspective, you have carbon footprinting in, as I've said a couple of times before, things like your bank account, things like a portfolio, things like your super fund. And there's an alphabet soup of ways to express carbon footprint, as there often is in the sustainability game, right?
Well, I'm glad you brought up superannuation, because I really want to get into kind of the practical kind of side of things here and what people can do. And as I said earlier in the pod, I mentioned our colleague with the 532 kilograms of grocery-related carbon emissions. So for her, myself, anyone else wanting to reduce their footprints, what are some of the practical steps that people can take?
I thought a lot about this, Tom, when you asked me onto the podcast, because there's the personal action and then there's the systemic action. So let's do the personal first, right? This is the old reduce, reuse, recycle, right? You can do stuff like compost your garden waste. You can walk or take public transport to the supermarket if you're going to be buying your groceries. Those are the things. You can look at getting renewable energy through your energy provider. Those are sort of the things that most people who live in Australia can do, whether you're a renter or a homeowner. The sort of the bigger tipping point things tend to be biased towards people who own homes, right? So, or investment properties. So things like putting solar on your roof and going off grid, electrifying your kitchen appliances, buying low carbon or low, energy efficient appliances. Those are other things you can do to lower your personal footprint. But that has a bias towards being in the property ladder.
You have to have the agency to be able to make those decisions at the end of the day, right?
Exactly. And I want to recognize that as well, that some of the choices that can drive positive activity on carbon require you to have assets underneath you, which not everybody in the listening audience may have. So you focus on the easy stuff first, right? Shop at an op shop instead of buying from, a big box store, for example, using active transport. Although again, active transport or public transport has a bias towards the cities. And I don't want to leave out our friends in the rural and regional areas of Australia either. And that's sort of the personal responsibility side of things. But there's another aspect about this that we really should be talking about, that, carbon footprint is an approximation of what we do in our daily lives, but we're really talking about the amount of carbon that's being released into our atmosphere as a world. To make systemic change, you have to work through systems. Right? What we do, for example, as you say, I'm from Melbourne. I flew up today on Qantas. I think every scrap of kitchen waste that I composted for an entire year just got ate up in the fact that I flew on an airplane.
Poor kitchen scraps.
I know, it's all for nothing. It's all been zeroed out in my carbon budget. So I think the thing that I like to focus on, and it's a lot of what we do at FS Sustainability and on the Greener Way, is talking about systemic actions. And the other thing that every working Australian has is your super fund. You are part of a whole when you're in your super fund. And look, we're talking about really, really big challenges, right? I talked about picking a renewable energy provider. First, we've got to build the renewable energy sources. So, for example, we did a little bit of a report earlier in the year that to decarbonize Australia's national electricity market, it's going to take about $500 billion between now and 2050. $500 billion. That's not pockets change you can shake out from behind your sofa.
No.
Right? On the other hand, also, there's the to transition heavy industry. A lot of our manufacturing base that is a huge employer and a huge part of our economy and our communities, it's going to take about $21 billion a year between now and 2050. Those are really, really big price tags. In Australia, we have the superannuation industry, which is a significant source of wealth and a significant source of strength. So you can make your choices in the way that you choose your superannuation provider. Superannuation funds are increasingly invested in that low carbon future. They're financing the solar farms. They're contributing to venture capital into funds that are looking to do things like sustainable aviation fuel. And so that's, I think, another way that people can use their options and do their research.
So going back, people have that agency to make or to take action through their super funds then.
Absolutely. And super funds are increasingly becoming more transparent about the activities they're taking on climate. I should give a pitch here for Money Magazine's Best of the Best issue, which is out now at newsstands and on subscription. Within the Best of the Best awards, we have categories for Best ESG Pension Fund, Best ESG Super Fund, Best ESG Domestic Equities Fund, and Best ESG International Equities Fund, if I've got those all correct. And within that, all of the funds, both the winner and the runners-up in each of those categories, are funds that are assessed on activities like taking action on climate. So whether it's a an international equities fund that specifically looks at whether or not portfolio companies are on a trajectory to decarbonize by 2050, or whether it's a super fund that's investing in domestic solar farms. You can take your dollars and attribute them in a way that will act towards that future.
Rachel, one thing I do want to bring up before we let you go, you talked about individuals.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about individuals.
Mm-hmm.
You also talked earlier on the podcast about how sometimes carbon footprints are viewed from a country level.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any contention around the fact that so much emphasis is placed on individuals when a lot of the responsibility comes down to companies as well? And is that kind of part of the debate at all in here?
Yes, certainly for me personally, and I think for a lot of people as well, because if you're putting the onus on individuals to consistently make choices in a really complicated world, like I don't necessarily know how to go out and calculate exactly how many tons of carbon emissions I'm putting into the atmosphere, and I've been doing this for 12 years. We also know that there are about 100 companies in the entire world that are most responsible for all of the carbon in the atmosphere through what they produce, typically fossil fuel producers, but so also aviation and heavy industry. So there has to be a recognition that it's not just individual choices, but the way that we engage at a systemic level. Pressing for policies that will invest in decarbonization. We now have a legislated net zero target for Australia. We've got a 43% cut by 2030. The government currently in power have made big commitments to triple the amount of renewable energy on tap by 2030. And that's, again, systemic levels. That's using taxpayer funds, investing, partnering with super funds and other investors to drive that outcome. So I think it's a really important point you make, Tom, that we have to, while we have personal responsibility and personal agency, we also have to act at the systems level to get the outcomes that we want.
I think that's an excellent place to leave things for today then. Rachel, before we let you go though, where can listeners find you if they want to read your words or listen to your voice on a regular basis?
Too easy. So I am, as Thomas said, the managing editor of FS Sustainability, which is at www.fssustainability.com.au. I also have a podcast, or we also have a podcast called The Greener Way, which you can find on all the platforms that you can find Friends with Money.
Go and check that out. Have a listen, subscribe. It's great. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure as always.
Anytime, Tom, anytime.
That's it for this episode of the Friends of Money podcast. But don't forget, you can keep up to date with all the latest financial news on our website by heading over to moneymag.com.au. Or if you've got a topic or a question that you'd love for us to explore, then you can shoot us an email through to podcast@moneymag.com.au. As always, we'll be right back in your podcast feed next week. So until then, I'm Tom Watson. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Friends with Money podcast. For credible, independent and easy to understand financial commentary, visit moneymag.com.au. Please remember that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are general in nature, and further independent advice and research based on your personal circumstances should be sought before making an investment decision.